The lake had been frozen for 6 weeks when Corporal Stanton Briggs finally stopped, pretending he was fine. He hadn't meant to drive that far north. He'd left Sudbury at 2:30 in the morning with no particular destination, just the need to move, the way he'd always needed to move when the walls of his apartment started breathing wrong. The Trans-Canada had taken him east for a while, then he'd turned north without thinking, following roads that got narrower and quieter until the pavement gave way to packed gravel, and the gravel gave way to a 2-track logging road ribboned with ice. He stopped the truck because he had to, not because he wanted to. The engine ticked in the cold. Outside, the temperature had dropped to somewhere around -31 with the wind chill, the kind of cold that Canadians joke about until it's actually happening to them, and then nobody jokes. The birch trees stood white and silent on both sides of the road, their upper branches locked together overhead like the fingers of people praying. Stanton sat with both hands on the wheel and watched his breath cloud the windshield and thought about absolutely nothing, which was the only thing he'd gotten good at since Ranger died. He would have sat there until the gas ran out, maybe. He was capable of that. He'd sat in worse places for longer. But then he heard it. It wasn't a bark. It was something smaller than a bark, something that came through the truck door like a question, tentative and cold and barely there. He turned down the heater fan and listened. There it was again. He got out. The wind hit him the moment the door opened, and he stood with his face turned into it the way he'd been trained to do, reading it. The sound came from the east, off the road, maybe 30 meters into the bush. He reached back into the truck for his headlamp and pulled his collar up and walked toward it. What he found was a Labrador retriever, black as the space between stars, lying in the depression of an old deadfall with her body curved around 2 puppies that couldn't have been more than 4 or 5 weeks old. The snow had drifted against her back. She didn't run when she saw him. She just raised her head and looked at him with eyes that held no fear, only exhaustion, the kind that lives deeper than muscle. Stanton crouched down and held out his hand, palm up, the way he'd been shown when he first got Ranger 15 years ago, before 2 tours, before Kandahar, before the morning in 2019 when a Belgian Malinois named Ranger had found the IED that Stanton hadn't, and taken the full weight of what happened next. He'd been told by the base veterinarian afterward that Ranger hadn't suffered. He'd chosen to believe that, most days. The mother dog stretched her neck and sniffed his knuckles. Then she put her head back down on her paws, and he understood that she was not going to get up on her own. She was past that. He carried her first, with the 2 puppies tucked inside his jacket against his chest, their small hearts beating against his sternum like something Morse-coded and urgent. He went back 3 times in the wrong direction before his headlamp found the truck again. By then his ears had gone numb and the puppies had stopped shivering, which he knew could mean 2 things. It meant one of those things, he decided. He chose that. He turned the heat on full and held each puppy in his hands, rubbing the warmth back into them, while the mother watched from the back seat with her chin resting on the center console. Her eyes tracked his hands with a steadiness that reminded him of someone who had survived something and was waiting to see what came next. "You're going to be all right," he told her. He hadn't said those words to another living creature in over 2 years. He drove south through the dark with the heater roaring and found the nearest open gas station at a place called Chaplow just before 4 in the morning, where a teenager named Cody sold him a bag of dog food and a package of paper towels without asking a single question, and for that Stanton was grateful in a way he couldn't have explained. He kept driving. His place was outside of Blind River, a small house on 11 acres that he'd bought because it was cheap, and the nearest neighbor was half a kilometer away, and nobody would bother him. He'd been there for 18 months. He knew the names of perhaps 4 people in town, the woman at the feed store, the man who plowed his road, the doctor he saw twice a year who asked him how he was sleeping and wrote a prescription for the answer. He didn't know the woman 2 properties over. He would learn later that her name was Sylvie. He would learn that she had been a nurse for 34 years, that she'd retired to Blind River to be near her sister, that she walked every morning at 7 regardless of the temperature because she'd been told it was good for her hip, and she was stubborn enough to believe it. He would learn that she had a son in the army, a boy named Pascal who was stationed in Latvia, and that she kept her phone face up on the kitchen table at all times the way people do when they are quietly afraid of missing something. But that morning, the first morning, he didn't know any of that. He carried the dogs inside and made a bed for them in the corner of the living room out of the blankets he'd never bothered to put away after he stopped sleeping in the bedroom. He sat on the floor beside them until the light outside changed from black to gray, and then he put the kettle on and stood at the kitchen window and watched the birch trees come back out of the dark. The puppies were alive, both of them. He hadn't been sure about the smaller one, the one he'd rubbed the hardest, the one who'd felt like a stone wrapped in fur when he first pulled her from inside his jacket. But she'd found her mother's side sometime around 5 in the morning and started nursing with a ferocity that seemed improbable for something that size, and he'd stood there in his socks on the cold floor watching her and feeling something in his chest that he did not have a name for. He named the mother Dusk. The smaller puppy he called Gale because of how she'd felt in his hands, like something the wind had thrown at him. The bigger one he didn't name for a week, because naming things felt like a commitment, and he wasn't sure yet what he was committing to. The days were strange after that. He'd had structure once, the kind that's imposed from outside early mornings and PT and briefings, and then after he left the Navy he'd tried to build his own. But structure requires a reason, and the reasons had been hard to find. Now the dogs gave him one. They needed to be fed at intervals. They needed warmth. The puppies needed their mother nearby, and she needed food and water, and he discovered a particular desire to be spoken to, because whenever he went quiet for too long, she would find him wherever he was in the house and put her chin on his knee and look at him until he said something. He started talking to her. Nothing important at first. What the temperature was, what he was going to eat, whether the snowmobile trail behind the property had been used recently. The kind of things he used to radio back to base, observational things, inventory. But somewhere around the 5th day, while he was sitting on the floor, and Dusk was leaning against his leg with her full weight, and the puppies were rolling over each other in the lamplight, he found himself telling her about Kandahar. He hadn't told anyone about Kandahar, not his sister in Owen Sound, not the doctor, not the veterans group he'd attended exactly twice before deciding he didn't want to sit in a circle with men who looked the way he felt. He told Dusk. He told her about the morning, the light, the way the dust in Afghanistan had a particular color at that hour that he'd never been able to adequately describe. He told her about Ranger's alert, the slight shift in posture that Stanton had learned to read like a language over 4 years. He told her about the moment he'd failed to read it correctly, or maybe correctly but too slowly, he was never sure which, and the not knowing was the part that had lodged in him and stayed. Dusk didn't move while he talked. She didn't try to fix anything. She just leaned. That was, he thought, the most useful thing anyone had done for him in years. The week after he found them, a woman appeared at his door. He'd heard the truck on the gravel and watched her from the kitchen window before he opened the door. A habit. She was in her late 60s, wearing a red parka that was practical rather than fashionable, carrying something covered in a dish towel. Her boots were the kind that mean business. He opened the door. "You the one who was driving around at 4 in the morning last week," she said. It wasn't quite a question. "Yes," he said. "Cody at the Husky told my sister. She told me." She held out the dish towel bundle. "Tourtière, it's still warm." He took it, mostly because he didn't know what else to do. "Sylvie Beaumont-Trask," she said, and extended her hand. "Stanton Briggs." She looked past him into the house. Dusk had appeared at the end of the hallway and was watching the doorway with her ears up. "That's her?" Sylvie said. "That's her. Cody said you had puppies, too. 2 of them." Sylvie looked at him with the particular directness of someone who has spent a career in hospitals and no longer sees the point in softening everything. "Are you going to make me stand outside?" she said. "Or are you going to offer me a coffee?" He made her a coffee. She sat at his kitchen table and held Gale in both hands with the careful ease of someone who had held small things that mattered, and she told him she'd been watching the property since he moved in, not in a suspicious way, she was clear about that, but in the way you watch a place that stays dark too long. She said she'd noticed he didn't get visitors. She said she understood about not getting visitors. Her son was overseas and her sister worked in Espanola, and the winter here had a way of making a person feel like the last one left on Earth. Stanton drank his coffee and didn't say much, but he refilled hers without being asked, and she noticed. She came back 3 days later, and 3 days after that. She brought things, but not performatively. She brought them the way practical people do, because she happened to have extra, and it seemed sensible. Bread she'd baked. A bag of dog kibble, better quality than what he'd been buying. A book she'd finished and thought he might like, a non-fiction account of the Franklin expedition, which was maybe the most Canadian gift he'd ever received. He read the book. He told her what he thought of it. She disagreed with his reading of one chapter and said so without apology. He found he didn't mind. The unnamed puppy, the larger one, the boy, became a problem around the 3rd week because he had discovered that he could fit his entire head inside one of Stanton's boots, and he was interested in doing this at every opportunity. Stanton tried to stay annoyed about it. He was not very successful. One morning he woke at 6 to find the puppy asleep on his chest. He lay still for a long time, feeling the small weight of him, the rise and fall. He named him Buck. Sylvie was there when he did it. She was at the kitchen table with her second coffee and the CBC playing quietly on the radio, the kind of presence that had stopped feeling like an intrusion somewhere around the 2nd week and started feeling like something else. Something he didn't have a word for yet but wasn't afraid of the way he'd expected to be. She smiled when he said the name. Buck, she repeated. He's stubborn, Stanton said. So are you, she said. Seems right. He didn't argue. She told him about Pascal that afternoon. She did it the way she did most things, directly, without much preamble. Pascal was 26, infantry. He'd signed up right out of high school in a way that had made her proud and terrified in equal measure for 7 years running. He called every Sunday if he could. He didn't always call. Stanton knew something about waiting for calls that didn't come. You were Navy, she said. It wasn't a question. CANSOFCOM, he said. 16 years. She absorbed this the way she absorbed everything, quietly, without the particular hunger some people had when he mentioned it, the want for details that he recognized as wanting something to belong to, a story they could carry away. Sylvie didn't want that. She just nodded. Hard years? She said. Some of them. But you stayed. For a while, he said. The rest of it he didn't offer and she didn't ask for, but he had the sense, sitting at the table with Dusk at his feet, and Buck already trying to get into his boot again, that the rest of it wasn't as sealed as it used to be, that the telling of some of it, to Dusk, in the dark, on the floor, had changed something structural about the way it sat inside him. He wasn't healed. He was clear enough about that. He knew the difference between healed and simply different, the way you know the difference between a bone that's set properly and one that's fused on its own. The outcome might look similar from the outside. Inside, it's its own thing. But he was sleeping in the bedroom again. He'd started doing that without noticing when it happened. And when he noticed, he stood in the doorway for a moment and thought about that. And then he went and got his pillow from the couch and put it back on the bed. March came in hard, the way it does in northern Ontario, pretending to be February for the first 3 weeks before finally relenting. The days got longer. Stanton started walking the property in the mornings with Dusk and the puppies, who were big enough now to tumble through the snow on their own, though Gail still had a tendency to get stuck in the deeper drifts and wait with an expression of profound indignation until someone came for her. He started noticing things he hadn't noticed since he moved in. The creek at the back of the property, still frozen but making sounds beneath the ice that suggested it was considering otherwise. The tracks of a fox that crossed his yard every night at roughly the same time. The way the light at 4 in the afternoon, when it hit the birch trees from the west, turned everything briefly gold. Sylvie had a fall. It wasn't serious in the grand scheme of things. A patch of ice she hadn't seen. A hip that was already unhappy about winter. A bruise that spread from her elbow to her shoulder blade and worried her doctor enough to insist she stay off the property for 2 weeks. Her sister came from Espanola, and Stanton learned this not because Sylvie told him, but because she didn't come by for 4 days, and he drove over to check. He found her in the kitchen, arm in a sling, looking annoyed about it. He drove her to the follow-up appointment in Elliott Lake because she couldn't shift gears. He waited in the parking lot with Dusk in the back seat and bought them both a coffee from the Tim Hortons across the street. And when Sylvie came out, she handed him back the cup without saying thank you, which she'd come to understand was how she accepted things that mattered. Her sister watched him from the passenger window with an expression that made him look away. He drove them home. Pascal called that Sunday for the first time in 6 weeks. Stanton knew because Sylvie came over afterward, later than she usually did, and she was quieter than usual, and she sat at his table and held her coffee in both hands and didn't say anything for a while. He didn't push. Eventually she said, "He sounds older." Stanton looked out the window at the yard where Buck was attempting to ambush Gale from behind a snowbank with an absence of stealth that was remarkable. "That happens," he said. She nodded. "When does it stop worrying you?" she said. It wasn't quite a question either. He thought about it honestly. "I'll let you know," he said. She made a sound that was almost a laugh. The ice went out on the lake at the end of April, later than usual. Stanton stood on the shore behind his property and watched it move out in plates, that particular slow grinding that happens when a winter finally lets go of something it's been holding. Dusk stood beside him with her shoulder against his thigh, watching it too, her ears moving slightly in the cold off the water. He thought about Ranger. He thought about him differently than he used to. Not with the flinching quality the memory had carried for years. That involuntary recoil as though the thought itself were the thing that could hurt him. He thought about him the way you eventually think about the people you've lost when you've been allowed to carry them long enough. With grief, yes, but also with something that felt close to gratitude. For the 4 years, for the particular intelligence in that dog's face that he'd never been able to explain to anyone who hadn't seen it. For the way Ranger had slept across Stanton's feet every night, in a way that was both an inconvenience and the most reliable comfort he'd ever known. He reached down and put his hand on Dusk's head. She leaned into it. Sylvie had brought her lawn chairs out of the garage the week before, optimistically, and set them on the small deck behind her house. He could see them from here, 2 green chairs facing the lake. He thought about the fact that there were 2 of them. He thought about a lot of things, standing there with the ice moving out, and the dog warm against his leg and the Canadian shield stretching north behind him, as far as his eye could reach, which in this light, in this season, was quite far. He wasn't the same man who'd parked on that logging road in January and sat in the cold with nowhere to go. He wasn't sure he could explain what the difference was, not in the way the veterans group wanted you to explain things, not in the language of programs and milestones and healing journeys. He only knew that somewhere between carrying a stranger's dog through the dark and learning that a woman named Sylvie took her coffee without sugar, the something that had been locked in him had shifted, not broken, not gone. Just moved, made room. The ice finished going out sometime in the night. He didn't see it happen. He was asleep. He drove into Blind River the next morning, early, and stopped at the hardware store before it opened and sat in the truck with Dusk in the passenger seat and a coffee going cold in the cup holder. When the owner unlocked the door at 8 o'clock, Stanton went in and bought a piece of pine board and some exterior paint, dark green, the color of the chairs. He didn't know exactly what he was going to put on it yet. He drove home and sanded the board on the back step, while Dusk supervised and the puppies tried to eat the sawdust, and then he went inside and stood at the kitchen table for a while, holding the brush. He thought about what Ranger had always been for him. Not just a working dog, not just a tool of the job, though he'd been trained to think of it that way. Something more native than that, a way of being in the world with less fear. A reminder that loyalty is not complicated if you don't make it complicated. He thought about Dusk in the snow, curved around 2 small lives, still warm despite everything. He painted 3 words. They weren't clever. He wasn't a man who went in for clever. They were just the thing that was true. He hung the board above the back door, where he could read it going in and out, and he stood back and looked at it, in the morning light coming off the lake. We stayed warm. He put the brush down. Behind him, from the end of the hallway, he heard Gale's particular bark. Short, declarative, the one she used when she wanted him to come and see something that she had found and was extremely proud of, whether or not he was going to be pleased about it. He went.